Dear ladies and gentlemen, пані та панове, I am sad and honored to open the final episode number 43 of our series of conversations and interviews with intellectuals in Ukraine and abroad. For those out there who are keen to learn more, think deeper, and hear from the original sources. Мені сумно і водночас почесно відкривати останню, 43-ю серію наших розмов та інтерв'ю з інтелектуалами в Україні та за кордоном для тих, хто прагне дізнатися більше, думати глибше і чути з перших джерел. Over the last year, since the 1st of March 2022, a week after the full-scale invasion, we would meet here to discuss the most urgent or complicated topics on ongoing war and what can we intellectuals do about that. Продовж останнього року, розпочинаючи від 1 березня 2020-го, через тиждень після повномасштабного вторгнення, ми почали зустрічатись тут, аби обговорити найактуальніші та найскладніші теми про війну, що триває, і що ми, як інтелектуали, можемо із цим зробити. Among our guests, we hosted Margaret Atwood, Philip Sands, Orhan Pamuk, Edith Eger, and Francis Fukuyama, or Arundhati Roy, speaking to Andrei Kurkov, Sergei Plakhy, Sofia Andrukhovich, Vladimir Yermolenko, or Alexander Matvichuk, or Miroslav Marinovich. I would like to name them all because this is a list of great minds and powerful voices, both from the Ukraine and the whole world. We found real friends and supporters and held really harsh debates sometimes. Серед наших гостей були Маргарет Етвуд, Філіп Сенс, Орхан Памук, Едіт Егер, Франсіс Фукуяма чи Арундаті Рой, які спілкувалися із Андрієм Курковим, Сергієм Плохієм, Софією Андрухович, Володимиром Єрмоленком, Олександрою Матвійчук та Мирославом Мариновичем. І хотілося би назвати їх усіх, бо це дійсно список великих умів і потужних голосів, як з України, так і з усього світу. Ми знайшли тут справжніх друзів і прихильників, і інколи навіть, мушу сказати, непогано сварилися. Over this period, our heroic colleagues from pan-Ukraine would stand at the front line of freedom of expression fight, spreading the word, organizing missions to the eastern and southern regions, bringing books to replace the ones burned by occupants, gathering evidences of committed crimes, taking all the efforts to preserve Ukrainian culture heritage, and even fighting as a part of support of Ukrainian army forces, as some of our writing colleagues. As PEN International, we will keep supporting this fighting for truth and freedom, and we're honored to provide a platform for freedom of expression for those currently under the highest risk. Упродовж цього періоду наші героїчні, не побоюсь того слова, колеги з українського ПЕН перебували на передовій боротьби за свободу слова, поширювали інформацію, організовують поїздки у східні та південні регіони, привозили книжки замість спалених окупантами, збирали докази та свідчення про скоєні злочини і докладали всіх зусиль для збереження української культурної спадщини. І навіть воювали і воюють у складі української армії, як дехто із наших колег-письменників. Як міжнародний ПЕН, ми продовжуватимемо підтримувати цю боротьбу за правду і свободу. Для нас було великою честю надати платформу для свободи слова тим, хто наразі перебуває у найбільшій небезпеці. I want to thank to our supporters who made the project real. The U.S. Embassy in Ukraine, PEN America, the Ukrainian Institute London, Olesya, Ukraine World, Local History, Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, the Harman Institute at Columbia University. We stream today's event to all partners' Facebook pages. Хочу, звісно, подякувати усім нашим партнерам, які допомогли проєкту здійснитися. Посольству США в Україні, PEN Америка, Українському інституту Лондона, Україні світ, локальні історії, Українському науково-дослідному інституту Гарвардського університету та інституту Гаррімана при Колумбійському університеті. Ми транслюємо сьогоднішню подію на всі партнерські сторінки у Facebook. Захід відбуватиметься, як звично, англійською мовою. My name is Olha Mukha, and I'm delighted to introduce our today's guests. Dr. Olesya Khromeychuk, one of the most powerful Ukrainian voices here in London. Olesya is a historian and writer focused on the history of East Central Europe. She has taught at the University of Cambridge, University College London, the University of East Anglia, and King College London. She's the author of Lost, the story of a dead soldier told by his sister, and Undetermined Ukrainians, post-war narratives of the Waffen-SS Galicia Division. She's currently the director of the Ukrainian Institute London. We are really grateful for our partnership, and incredible culture ambassador of Ukraine in the world, sharing the insights of what does it take to decolonize Western academia. to decenter our focus when studying the whole region and Ukraine in particular. Thank you for joining us today, Olesya. And Olesya will hold her dialogue or conversation with Professor Timothy Garton Ash, one of the top global public intellectuals, the author of 11 books of political writing for history of present, which have charted the transformation of Europe over the last half century. He's professor of European Studies in the University of Oxford, Isaiah Berlin Professorial Fellow at St. Anthony's College, Oxford, and a Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University. So today we are in strictly academic mode. Not going to list all your books, we just will refer to the two last ones. Free Speech, 10 Principles for a Connected World, published in 2016, which won the British Academy Naya Al-Rajian Prize for Transcultural Understanding. Let's hope that it will help us to understand the cultural context of the ongoing war. And the new book, Homelands, The Personal History of Europe, which has published in English in March 2023, and will subsequently be appearing in at least 17 other languages, including Ukrainian, by Vichova Publisher House. Congratulations, and can't wait for it. Also interested to hear your impressions from visit last December and this February, and evolution of Ukrainian and Western attitudes. A lot of things to discuss, so I will disappear from the screen. Thank you for joining us today. We expect dialogue full of insights and ideas, and the floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be doing this with you. Which of us is meant to go first?
You, Professor.
Okay. So, as you mentioned, I've been traveling, studying, writing about, worrying about Europe for 50 years now, which is a period covered in that book, Homelands. What I never imagined when I started writing it was that it would go from one major land war in Europe, 1945, to another major land war in Europe, 2022. So that what is happening in Ukraine is without question, for me, the most important thing happening in Europe at the moment. As you mentioned, I've been to two unforgettable visits, one to Lviv in December and one to Kiev in February, where I met, amongst others, General Zaluzhny, Mr. Budanov, the head of military intelligence, Andrei Yermak, but also many, many other intellectuals. Before I go any further, can I just mention one person who I met in Lviv in December? His name was Yevgen Hulevich. He was an editor, translator. He'd seen the Ukrainian edition of Ray Bradbury's Something Wicked This Way Comes, a very telling title, through to publication. After the 24th of February 2022, he volunteered to fight, wounded, came back to Lviv, got better, went back to the front, week after week, fighting in the terrible battle for Kherson, living in a foxhole he dug out himself, wounded in the back and both legs. When I met him in December, he was just getting better. He was determined to go back. He said, my comrades need experienced soldiers like me. And then he said rather wistfully, I hope I will see what my country is like after the war. A few days ago, I got the terrible news that he was killed in the fighting near Bakhmut on the 31st of December last year. So I'd like to dedicate this conversation to him. So on the one hand, there's that terrible suffering, which of course you, Olesya, have written about so brilliantly. On the other hand, there is, and this for me is such a key Ukrainian word, the volya, the will, the courage, the fighting spirit. I mean, in many ways, it felt to me like 2022-23 is for Ukraine what 1940 was for Britain, the moment of great national emergency, but also of great national solidarity and spirit, and one that defines your country for decades, even a century ahead. In the moment, and then I'll hand over to Olesya, in the moment, what is top in my mind is, particularly having talked to Zaluzhny and others, clearly the big offensive that is coming up in the next weeks is going to be absolutely crucial. And it's just so vital that that offensive succeeds in taking a big chunk of territory and clearly inflicting a big defeat on the Russian side, because I'm afraid that a long war of attrition to and fro in the Donbass is going to play for Putin more than it plays for Ukraine. Time is of the essence for Ukraine, also because I'm afraid, and this I think we need to talk about, what I saw happening with Bosnia in the early 1990s, which is after a year, however much goodwill there is, the interest begins to fade and it slides down the news agenda. And the journalists have written every single story they can think of, the Ukrainian railways story, the culture story, this story, 100 times. And the news desk starts saying we're going to cut the budget for Kiev. And so, there's a real danger, I think, for Ukraine there if this thing drags on, which is why I anticipate eagerly, but also somewhat nervously, this offensive, because it's just so important that Ukraine is seen to be winning this year. So those are my very initial thoughts. Obviously, there's much more to be said, but Olesya, I'd love to hear how it seems to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, PEN Ukraine. Thank you, all co-organizers of this absolutely amazing series. I enjoyed so many conversations immensely, and I've bookmarked the rest that I haven't had the chance to listen to yet. It's a fantastic opportunity to listen to various perspectives from all around the world in conversation, which I think something that hasn't happened enough in the past in conversation with Ukrainians and Ukraine experts. But also it creates a fantastic, I think, archive of the way we're thinking about this horrendous war at the present, which I think we will revisit in the future to remember these moments and remember these issues that we were discussing in the middle of it. And also I want to thank Professor Garton Ash for being in conversation with me. I started learning from you as a student when I was at Oxford, and I continue learning from you throughout all of these years, and I'm sure that I'll learn a lot in this conversation as well. So it's an absolute privilege and honor for me to speak specifically with you today. On this 400th day of full-scale invasion, of full-scale war, and of course 9 years since the war started, since Russia started the war in Ukraine, I think it's really important that you mention how people that we meet in our professional life through publishing, through writing, journalists, and in my case, theater makers as well, and historians and other academics, and also in my case, my cousins who are only just beginning their lives. They're in their early 20s, village boys who are trying to figure out which university they should go to or which job they should take, and they go to the front, and they so many of them lose their lives in this war. So it's important that we dedicate all of our conversations, I think, to those people who are fighting in and out of trenches in Ukraine. What's been on my mind, of course, those same issues that you're talking about too, but also this idea that we've entered this strange period of anniversaries, 1 year anniversary since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, of course, on the 24th of February, which was, I think, very meaningful to a lot of people to revisit that day of shock and the beginning of this particular type of brutality inflicted by the Russian army on the Ukrainian nation. But also then the anniversary of the bombing of Mariupol drama theater, which I think was another serious milestone. Already a lot of displaced Ukrainians ended up, say, in my hometown in Lviv from Mariupol, and those who managed to escape, and we were watching with horror how hundreds of people hiding in the shelter, which clearly had a sign marked children, were being bombed by the Russians. And another anniversary is coming up in a couple of days, and that's the anniversary of Bucha, or rather our realization of what actually happened in Bucha during Russian occupation. So on the 1st of April, we started to see photographic and video evidence of the massacre that the Russians left behind them. And I think here it's very important to reflect how was this possible? Where did we go wrong as an international community? Why did we not realize sooner? I know Ukrainians did, but perhaps not everybody, that mass atrocities are part of Russian military strategy. So as historians, we both know that the Soviet army accepted mass rapes, looting, and commitment of war crimes as a way to wage wars, and that culture was inherited by the subsequent post-Soviet armies, and there was also a difficult legacy that had to be dealt with in Ukraine too. But the Ukrainian army has addressed that legacy of acceptance of violence, acceptance of bullying inside the army, and of course perpetration of crimes as the army faces civilians, especially since 2014. And we see huge reforms, and we see the Ukrainian army now, which is totally different. In Russia, it was the opposite. These war crimes were normalized, they were encouraged. We saw them in Syria, we saw them in Chechnya, and we see them in Ukraine. And it's the idea of impunity, I think, the fact that the Russians have never had to face punishment or appropriate punishment for the perpetration of war crimes, that led to this normalization of violence, both inside Russia, but also, us as the democratic world that has accepted it. And I suppose now is the major question, as well as Ukrainian victory, that you brought up. I think it's also ensuring that there's justice, and that justice is administered, and that this victory and the peace that comes after victory is lasting. And the only way for it to be lasting is to ensure that there's a form of justice. And what we've seen moves in that direction. This is actually something that I wanted to ask you. Often people use post-war, post-Second World War practices as some sort of blueprint. Well, this is what happened with Nuremberg trial, therefore we can expect that something similar is going to happen. Or indeed, the experience of Yugoslav wars as well. But I'd like to take inspiration from Olesya Khromeychuk, who's last year's Nobel Peace Prize winner, where she says, well, we don't need to follow those previous examples. We are here to change the systems if the systems are not working. And I think ICC's decision to issue an arrest warrant for Putin is one of these examples where we are changing the systems. And the fact that this is an extremely well-documented war, and it's been documented not just by human rights lawyers and professionals from the field, but by writers. As you know, PEN Ukraine travels the country and documents these absolutely horrendous crimes. So if we've got these documentations, we need to act on them as well. Do you have faith in us being able to ensure that justice prevails in Ukraine?
It's such a great question. I mean, thanks to PEN Ukraine, I spent a day traveling around Bucha, Irpin, Hostomel, Borodyanka, all the famous sites of atrocities. And of course, particularly in the imagination of the world, Bucha in particular has taken its place beside Srebrenica. It's the evident horror of people with their hands tied behind their backs being, shot in the back of the head. And also it's a word which rhymes with butcher, and everyone can pronounce. And so it's become a synonym for barbaric butchery. It was also incredibly striking to me how, I had a lovely conversation with various writers and intellectuals connected by a Ukrainian PEN in Kiev. It was all about documentation and accountability. Everybody in their different ways working on it. Many people said to me, this is going to be the best documented war in history. When we get to justice, I want to nuance this a bit, because, look, it's a great, great day that Vladimir Putin is indicted as a war criminal by the ICC. I'm delighted that it's happened. I think it'll have an impact. It's a long way before you get him to The Hague. It's a great, for me, as someone who witnessed the wars in former Yugoslavia, the fact that Slobodan Milosevic ended his days in The Hague, and that Radovan Karadzic, the other key figure, is now serving his life sentence in a British prison, somewhere maybe just up the road from here. That's a fantastic achievement for justice and for international liberal order. But obviously, it might happen. It could still happen. I hope it will happen. I pray it will happen one day. But obviously, it's going to be more difficult. So that the other thing I wanted to say is, I think your colleague introducing us said za pravda I svobodu. And the pravda bit of it seems to me very important, because everything that Russia has done has had this thick guard of lies. And so my view is that as well as going down the judicial route and looking for judicial accountability, Nuremberg, ICC, call it what you will, we should also be going down the route of looking to document the truth as something of value in itself. So one of the things I wanted to suggest behind Philip Sands' great initiative for the Special Tribunal is something like an International Truth Commission. Because one of the things, I spent 3 weeks in South Africa in 1997 looking at the Truth Commission headed by Desmond Tutu. And one of the things South Africans said at that time was, if we can't have justice, at least we can have truth. And truth itself is a kind of justice. So my thought on that is, particularly because of the role of lies in what Russia is doing, I think we should think of doing something like an International Truth Commission, so that the facts are documented beyond any reasonable doubt and publicly acknowledged. Of course, Russian propaganda is still going to deny the whole thing. Of course, ordinary Russians are still going to deny the whole thing. I'll never forget in Kiev a conversation with a young guy called Dmitry, 17 years old, from Mariupol, saw a child killed in front of his father's eyes, saw terrible things. They telephoned this young man's uncle, who was a Russian in Russia. You know what's coming. He said, it's not true. They sent WhatsApp messages and photographs. He still said it's not true. Such is the power of denial. So that I think justice, absolutely, but I think also truth.
I can't agree more with you. And sadly, I have my own stories, family stories of similar kind to share about family that I have in Russia. And I'm sure that most Ukrainians have a story like that to share. So when people talk about, we can't rely on surveys and polls from Russia because people are too afraid to answer honestly, well, what we can rely on is anecdotal evidence that exists inside Ukraine from people who speak to their relatives or used to speak to their relatives. And each one of us has a similar story to tell.
By the way, if I may just say one word there quickly, Olesya, because it's so interesting. The same thing was true of Germany in 1944-45. And I think the comparison, and I at the beginning of my book, I go back to the village which my father's gun troop, British gun troop, occupied in 1945 and talked to the old Germans. And one of them said, I was a Hitler youth, and until the day the British forces arrived, I believed that we would win. And in a way, the tragedy for Russia is that it's unlikely to experience that kind of total defeat, where nobody can deny, as in 1945 in Germany, nobody could deny, right? So you were asking for a historical comparison. Nobody could deny that Germany had lost, and then up the road was Bergen-Belsen, and the German guards were confronted, and the local population were confronted with what had happened in Bergen-Belsen. And 40 years later, Richard von Weizsäcker, the German president, made a great speech in 1985 on the 40th anniversary of the end of the war, saying basically, defeat was the best thing that happened to us. That was the foundation of our freedom, of our democracy, of our respect for human rights and the rule of law. And it's a Russian tragedy, too, that that's not going to happen to Russia in the same way.
I love that opening of your book. I really enjoyed how you weave your own story and your father's story into the history as well as one wonderful way to understand how these events affect individual people and then linger for such a long time. On the question of defeat, history doesn't really repeat itself, does it? But a sufficient defeat, I think, for the Russian population would be to understand that the imperialist project is no longer working for them. And for that, all we need is to make sure that we deoccupy Crimea.
Exactly so. And for me, Olesya, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because in the next few weeks, if things go well with an offensive that goes south to the Sea of Azov, the West is going to be confronted with something that it simply hasn't faced up to, which is the public position of all Western leaders is territorial integrity. It's up to the Ukrainians to decide. In private, I can assure you, most people say, well, not Crimea. I have changed my mind about this. I'll be quite honest with you. At the beginning of the war, I thought back to the lines of 23rd February. Having been twice in Ukraine, talked to people, I can see, I mean, all along I could see the historical argument. I tell in the book the story of meeting Vladimir Putin as a totally unknown deputy mayor of St. Petersburg in 1994. And this rather unpleasant-looking man sits silently for 2 days, and then he pipes up and says, there are territories that were always, keyword, always Russian. Of course, totally untrue. And they're now outside Russia, the Russian Federation, and we have a duty towards them. And he explicitly mentioned Crimea, 1994, 20 years before, 2014, and 25 million Russians, quote unquote, outside Russia, and we have a duty to protect them. So the historical argument is clearly invalid. I mean, if you're talking about long-term historical claims, it's the Crimean Tatars, right? The legal claim is absolutely clear. The moral claim, I just mentioned Yevhen Hulevich. I asked him about this, and his response was, too many people have died. But above all, the strategic argument, short and long term. Short term, because, and this is what both Zaluzhny and Budanov and Yermak and many others put to me, this is what really matters to Putin and Russia. And this is the thing which you can really pressurize quickly. Donbass, it's a long, long grind. But here, if you cut the Kerch Bridge, the Russians are encircled in Crimea. So that's a short-term strategic argument. This is the real pressure point, which, by the way, is the reason many people in the West don't want Ukraine to go for Crimea. The very same reason that produces the strategic logic of going for it for the Ukrainian armed forces is the reason the West are saying, hang on a minute, maybe Putin will escalate. But there's also the long-term strategic argument, which in my view is twofold. Number one, Ukraine can never have proper security if you basically got this huge terrestrial aircraft carrier, which is Crimea, threatening you. But also the Black Sea can never be secure, right? Whereas if you have NATO member Ukraine to the north down the road and NATO member Turkey to the south, then the Black Sea is secure. And of course, the lesson for China. Because if Putin hangs on to Crimea, then Xi Jinping can think maybe it's worth having a go at Taiwan. There's the analogy. So I couldn't agree with you more, but you know as well as I that this is an argument which has not been won in the West.
Well, I don't know. Let's see what happens. Ukraine surprised a lot of people more than once. I mean, a year ago, we were still being given a few weeks to last, and lots of things changed since, and EU candidacy and so on. But on the question of Crimea, for more than 8 years, whenever I raised it, I was being in public debates. I completely agree with you here. I was being told that I was being naive and emotional. And that Crimea is a done deal. Then I started to hear less and less of those conversations. People were not prepared to say that anymore. And now, at least this discussion and contemplation. And it's funny that exactly what you just pointed out. I mean, it's actually not pragmatic to allow Crimea to continue being occupied by the Russians for all the reasons that you've identified, but also because it'll continue to be a launching platform against the rest of Ukrainian territory by the Russians. It's highly militarized already because it relies on resources such as freshwater supply on southern Ukraine. And also for ethical reasons, and we should not brush those away. I mean, we've been watching and accepting, by watching and not doing anything, genocide of Crimean Tatars since 2014. And again, as historians, we know that's already been attempted once, and the fact that Crimean Tatars returned to Crimea is a sign of their will and a bit of a miracle. And now to allow that to happen and to continue to happen, we know the vast majority of political prisoners from Ukrainian political prisoners in Russia are Crimean Tatars. They are being targeted. So what moral right do we have to accept it and to continue accepting it? And we should take responsibility for accepting it for so long. And here the question is, I think it's something that you've raised already, is that it's the change, right? So the change, you said that you've changed your mind, and I'm really glad to hear about that. But it's this perception. So often people who talk about concessions that Ukraine should consider in order to secure peace often talk about the territory. They don't talk about people, they talk about the territory. Well, why don't you leave Crimea? Why don't you let go bits of Donbass? And I think one way to understand the difference between the way Ukrainians feel about that territory and the way people talk about this territory is to look at footage of Mariinka. I'm sure you've seen this drone footage of Mariinka. That's an example of a place that was inhabited, that had a life, becoming territory. Completely completely destroyed, razed to the ground. It's some kind of post-apocalyptic image now that we see. And the references to territory seem to come from unfamiliarity, right? If you're not familiar with a place, if you don't have those personal connections that you so beautifully describe in your recent book, when different types of Europe and how you feel at home in Europe, and it's beautiful to hear that, then perhaps you will not be able to have to apply some kind of identity to that place. And I think Ukraine suffered from this idea in people's heads, either as complete black hole, a small country, when in fact it's the largest within Europe, a small country that has no identity, there's some kind of buffer zone between Russia and the rest of us, and so on. And here I want to bring up one of the articles that I, with great joy, shared with all my students at the start, usually, of courses on East Central European history. Your article that you wrote in 1999, I'm sure you still remember that text. It's The Puzzle of Central Europe for New York Review of Books. And I loved teaching it and rereading it every year, but I was always slightly taken aback by references to Ukraine in that article. At the time I was still living in Ukraine. When you wrote it, I was still living in Ukraine. I left in 2000. And I remember when you describe, how do you experience the difference between one type of Europe and another type of Europe? You go across the border to Uzhhorod, to Ukraine, and suddenly you're met by this, I think you call them post-communist mafiosi, sort of men, leather jackets and short hair and so on. And that's not untrue, of course. That is exactly what you could find in 1999 in Ukraine, but also the Ukraine that I remember of my childhood when I was living there at the same time is Ukraine of exciting theater, of fantastically brave literature, really experimental, sort of thing that wasn't really happening elsewhere in the region to the same degree. And yet, a lot of people only associated it with this sort of darkness and fear and, the sort of Europe that is a bit scary and incomprehensible. Has it changed, would you say? Have people discovered this terra incognita? And maybe what we have done differently as Ukrainians to communicate our assets beyond those that became familiar and, associated with Ukraine?
So it's really interesting you mentioned that, because I think what we've seen is two things which are layered on top each other. One is what I call intra-European Orientalism, the othering of Eastern Europe as a whole, which, as you know, a guy called Larry Wolff wrote a wonderful book about this, goes all the way back to the Enlightenment. And I quote in my book a French writer, early 20th century French writer, Gonzague de Reynaud, actually French-Swiss, who says, Western Europe is more civilized than Eastern Europe. And then he describes Western Europe as l'Europe européenne, the European Europe. So by implication, Eastern Europe can't be European. So you have that phenomenon, which is under which Estonia and Poland and the Czech Republic have suffered as much as anyone else. And then on top of that, you have the failure to see Ukraine as anything other than part of Russia. I actually thought we might talk about this, so I brought along to show people the famous 11th edition of the encyclopedia. Oh no, you can't see it because of this bloody background. There we are. And this is 1910, 1911. And the entry for Ukraine comes between Ukaz and Ulan. And there are 10 lines on Ukaz, 13 lines on Ulan, and just 5 lines on Ukraine. It says Ukraine, this is 1910, the name previously given to a district of European Russia, now comprising the governments of Kharkov, Kiev, Podolia, and Poltava. It's just part of Russia. So that's what you're up against. You're up against that double, layering, which persisted for so long. You know about the famous notorious article Helmut Schmidt, the former German chancellor, wrote in 2014, in which he said, 2014, he said, Ukraine is an independent state, but not a nation state. And then he says, before 1990, no one doubted that Ukraine belonged to Russia. I mean, an incredible statement to make in 2014. So to your question, has it changed? I think it has changed dramatically, but still has a long way to go. For me personally, and I plead guilty to sort of identifying Central Europe as in some sense stopping at the frontier to Western Ukraine in the 1990s. Although, Ukraine in the 1990s, it was a complicated story. I mean, for me personally, the Orange Revolution, which I experienced in Kiev, was the moment when one saw that new Ukraine. And then, of course, 2014, and then 2022, those 3 great formative moments. And I think everybody now knows Ukraine is a large, important, independent, sovereign, distinctive European country. And for me, the specifically Ukrainian version of Volya is one particularly fascinating. You can find online a great lecture by an expert on Ukraine at Cambridge University, just exploring the word and its role in Ukrainian literature. So that's really, really fascinating. But there's still a way to go. There's still a way to go to overcome all these stereotypes and all this simply ignorance. Frankly, I'm not sure there's all that much you could have done about it, unless your oligarchs, billionaires, millionaires, call them what they will, were really prepared to put a hell of a lot of money into funding chairs in Ukrainian studies, chairs in Ukrainian history and culture at great Western universities, which is now beginning to happen, of course. Because I think you have to start right at the beginning with education, and then with culture, and then with journalists. I think that is now starting to happen.
Yeah, not thanks to the oligarchs, but mostly thanks to...
No thanks to the oligarchs, although of course Firtash did fund Ukrainian studies at...
grassroots initiatives from colleagues.
At Cambridge, which is, the old Latin saying, pecunia non olet, money doesn't stink. One has to stretch that rather hard in the case of Firtash, I think.
Yeah, but Cambridge Ukrainian Studies, who we also partner with regularly, does absolutely amazing work. And often when I see experts with true expertise on Ukraine, and not the ones who suddenly woke up, who had been studying Russia for a long time and then woke up the next day and thought, oh, Ukraine is sexy, therefore I'm an expert on Ukraine now. But the ones with true expertise tend to have some kind of connection or root to Cambridge Ukrainian Studies. So I'm very grateful to them for that. But that is actually a question I wanted to explore a bit more in this conversation. Going back to my time at Oxford that I mentioned quite a few years ago when I was an MA student there, when I considered doing my PhD, I understood that I fell between the cracks. I wanted to do a PhD on Ukrainian history of the Second World War. And I realized that the Russian and East European Center didn't really have the sort of expertise that were necessary for me. And the European Center, your center, didn't have it either. And so Ukraine very often wasn't European enough and was not Russian enough, as it were, to kind of fit into either of those places. Frankly, I don't see a massive shift yet. There's a lot of will. So coming back to the idea of Ukrainian vola, not just freedom, but also will. There's a lot of goodwill around among our colleagues. And like I said, especially grassroots initiatives. There are a lot of lobbying and pressure coming from scholars, Ukrainian scholars who ended up in the West as displaced scholars, scholars at risk. But I don't see massive structural changes. So the issue that I have right now, since there is this shift, this discovery of Ukraine, how do we turn this situational interest in Ukraine, because it is situational, it's caused by Russian genocidal attempt to wipe Ukrainian culture, nation, and statehood. How do we change that situational interest into structural change? How do we make sure that there's a shift that is irreversible? Because I can see that in many different aspects of the sort of, what we deal with, journalism, academia, political sphere, and so on, a lot of things can go back to some extent to business as usual, the cultural sphere as well. Because it's just convenient, and because we don't have an awful lot of Ukraine experts with really loud voices. We've got more and more of them now, but I think the structural shift is absolutely essential. But how do we make it happen?
So it's such an important point. Before 1989, my center was called the West European Studies Center. And then there was the Russian and East European, and East Europe was arbitrarily defined as everything which had fallen under Soviet control after 1945. So East Germany, totally arbitrary, becomes Eastern Europe. One of our achievements of which I'm proud is that after the end of the Cold War, we became the European Studies Center, and our mission was to study the whole of Europe and Europe as a whole. And the Russian Center was renamed the Russian and Eurasian Studies Center. So that was already progress, but as you rightly say, Ukraine was falling between the cracks. And now this is beginning to shift, not just because of the huge interest in the rest of the world, but also because of the so important fact that Ukraine is now a candidate for EU membership. Because that means that anyone who is studying Europe with its central political institution being the European Union has to start paying attention to such a big candidate country. So that's already having a positive effect to some extent. Nonetheless, there is a huge problem of inertia in the structuring of academia, not just in this country, but also very much in the United States, because whole careers have been made, whole buildings dedicated to, whole funding flows steered towards something called Russian and East European studies, right? And there's whole generations of academics, particularly in the English-speaking world, who've grown up, but also in Germany and France, who've grown up through this. And I like to say, we would have found it pretty odd if 30 plus years after 1945, there'd still been courses in German and East European studies, right? Or shall we say, French and Maghrebi studies, right? So somehow this relic of empire in a sense, but then it's a relic of empire that builds not only on these institutional interests, but also on the intra-European Orientalism I was talking about a moment ago. In short, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's going to take a hell of a lot of work to address and get over it. Obviously, we need the chairs in Ukrainian studies. We need the courses in Ukrainian studies. But my way forward would not be to start operating more with the terms like Central or East European. My way forward would be to just say European studies. It's European as a whole, and this Europe, which I write about in my book, the real Europe, is more than 40 different countries, each with their cultures, languages, subnational, regional, amazing cities, and so on. That's where I think we want to go, not to sort of develop a new subdivision instead of the old subdivision, but actually to move forward to studying Europe as a whole.
Absolutely, and if we are going to stick to geography, which is not necessary, but convenient, if we are going to look at Europe, then perhaps we should also think about decentering our focus. So moving away in European studies from Western Europe and beginning to value the voices that have the sort of experience of vola, of freedom and fight for it, that maybe some in other parts of Europe lack that specific experience. In particular here, I mean relationship with imperial relationship, colonial relationship with Russia. Those voices have not been heard enough, and this is both the voices from Poland and the Baltic states and elsewhere in Central Europe and Northern Europe that have been dismissed for so long because they haven't been valued as credible voices, because they don't come dressed in the sort of outfits that speak authority to us. So this is a question to us again: why do we still have this imperialist view, or gaze ourselves on other parts of Europe that are less familiar to us? Why do we maintain it? I like to compare or draw an analogy that with football, and I'm not a football fan at all, but it's it's this football and there's women's football. One's a norm, the other one's a curiosity, and it's been often like that with Europe. There's Europe proper, we all know what it means to some degree, and then there's East Central Europe or Eastern Europe, this sort of strange curiosity that isn't really taken seriously in discussions. But it has to be taken seriously now. We have to decenter our attention. How do we do that when for so many people understanding that part of the world which goes beyond East Central Europe was, it seemed sufficient to read Dostoevsky. It seemed sufficient to know a few composers that are Russian. It seemed sufficient to explore the so-called Great Russian culture and explore it completely uncritically. And there was this lack of anti-imperial critique of that culture. And through that culture, then we saw the rest of the region. It has to change, it has to shift. And this is not just about Ukraine and creating chairs in Ukrainian studies, it's about the region as a whole. Those voices need to become credible, but this is, I think, the work that we need to do. It's not necessarily for Ukrainians or Poles or Estonians.
I think it's both, isn't it? I think it's both. It has to be a joint enterprise. I've sometimes talked about the decolonization of the Western mind. But it's very interesting because when we talk about the decolonization of, say, the German view of Ukraine, we don't mean that they see it through the lens of German colonial history, although there was a German colonial history. They see it through the Russian lens, whereas if we talk about the decolonization of the French view of the Maghreb, they're talking about their own colonial history. So it's a rather specific instance of this. I mean, one thing that's on our side is that the subject of empire is back big time in our culture, also because of the quite correct perception that we in countries like Britain or France have not sufficiently faced up to our own colonial past. Rhodes must fall and all of that. And so it's quite helpful, the framing of it as a narrative of decolonization. One thing in Kiev that really struck me was the renaming of Pushkin Street. And a lot of us would then say, well, hang on a minute, Pushkin, really? And then someone said to me, there's no Shakespeare Street, there's no Molière Street, there's no Dante Street. It was a colonial statement, and then one understood that this, in the logic of decolonization. So I think there's a lot to be done, so to speak, from our side, from people outside Ukraine, but also let me give you an illustration of this problem. So as one or two of the people who are listening may know, it's almost an accepted fact in Germany that I coined the term Scholzing and defined it, apropos Olaf Scholz, as being to declare your good intentions and then to do everything possible to make sure they didn't come about. Now, Olesya, this is a Ukrainian meme. It goes all the way back to last summer. And I literally just retweeted, a mock-up with exactly that definition, which a friend of mine in Kiev had sent me on WhatsApp, right? Now, someone pointed out to me, they said it's not accidental that it really caught on when, a not totally unknown professor from Oxford retweeted it, whereas Ukrainians had been doing it for a year beforehand. So I think that's very telling. So yes, Ukrainians have to tell their stories in ways which penetrate the bubbles, penetrate the colonial mindsets, are held to be credible. But we also have to take those Ukrainian voices seriously. And I think there's going to be a really critical moment, which is what I call the day after. So long as the war is going on, there's going to be a focus on Ukraine. But I saw what happened with Bosnia, what happened with Poland after 1981, Czechoslovakia after 1968. Every publisher wants their Czech book, their Polish book, now their Ukrainian book. Every producer wants their Ukrainian program. Every theater wants their Ukrainian piece. And that lasts another 6 months or something, and then everybody moves on. So I think preparing for the day after, preparing a more lasting influence is something it's worth thinking quite hard about right now.
Absolutely. That is such a good point. I want to ask you something about that, to explore it a bit more and maybe to begin to think about the day after collectively. I just wanted to make a very brief remark about Pushkin. This is an excellent example of the uncritical understanding of the great Russian culture. So, I so often hear, well, what have you got, why do you try to so-called cancel, which I actually dislike as a term entirely in this context, all Russian culture. It's not Putin, it's not Pushkin, it's Putin. But of course, if we can look at what's happening now. So for instance, places like Mariupol theater that was bombed, covered in different, scaffolding with pictures of Russian writers, including Pushkin appearing, Pushkin becoming a symbol of occupation, because the portrait of him appears in occupied territories, temporarily occupied territories by the Russians. But also we can go back and we can look at Brodsky's poem on Ukrainian independence in the early 90s, where he says that, when Ukrainians, he calls them Cossacks and all sorts of other things, less pleasant than Cossacks, when he addresses the Ukrainian brother, so-called, when you'll be dying, it'll be the lines of Pushkin or the lines of Alexander and not the lies of Taras, meaning Shevchenko, that you will be saying on your deathbed. So it's this constant imposition of the culture, and that culture becoming essentially a tool of oppression. So I think that is something that's been misunderstood for a long time, why we have this perception.
Yeah, I get that now. Although, if I may say so, I think what you want to try to do is to get people to take Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian history, Ukrainian writers, Ukrainian viewpoints as seriously as French or German ones, rather than to try and persuade the rest of the world that we need to, cancel is the wrong word, but, see the blood on, so to speak, Pushkin's hands. Because you're adding an additional weight to your weightlifting if you do that. And I sometimes hear that in the way Ukrainians frame this. I totally understand what you're saying, but I think you want to emphasize more the positive about what is so fascinating about Ukraine than going on about the negative.
Absolutely. But one has to make space for that anti-imperialist defiant culture that comes from Ukraine. And that space is so frequently occupied by the Russian culture. And that's why I think there's this resistance.
Also outside Europe, of course.
Indeed. Absolutely. I can see that Olha appeared on the screen. Many other questions, but I will stop.
Yeah, thank you so much. What a conversation. I absolutely hate to interrupt it, but I wanted personally to thank you, Professor, of course, starting from the dedication to Evgen Gulevich, good friend of a lot of us and just incredible personality. which can be basically an emblematic case of this war. It's when highly educated, intelligent, highly sensitive intellectual given his life for craziest and the last pragmatic war in history. And our Lviv colleagues are gathering an archive of memories about Evgeny. So please join with yours. That would be really nice to have memories of him. And you started from the issue of accountability, the best documented war in history, achievements for justice, but mentioned that it's still a long way forward. And here we have a question from one of our active listeners, Lee McDonald. I'll rephrase it a bit, probably not such a harsh way, but Russians are scheduled to take the chairmanship of the UNSC on April 1st. What an insult for an entire world, he says that. And what is your opinion on the situation on this? I'll quote Lee here, he says, terrible abomination. And if the international organization are still functional and capable to keep any world order, or how should we deal with those who are breaking the rules?
He was talking about the OSCE. Yeah. I don't think Russia should have the chairmanship of the OSCE. I think they should find a way of suspending Russia. I mean, it's important to keep channels of communication open, even with, you know, the most barbaric regimes, but I don't think this is an organization which is meant to be based on international law. So I think we should find a way to suspend that membership.
Yeah, I agree completely. And of course, this is another example where the old systems and the old institutions have shown themselves in need of profound reform. That they've made themselves irrelevant, and if they become irrelevant, the new institutions have to come in their stead.
Yeah, let's see in 2 days, literally, what's going to be the answer, right? Another question is about Russian propaganda and Ukrainian narratives. Olesya mentioned it in the very beginning, those questions to Ukraine, right? And messages we are not communicating clear enough. What is the biggest challenge while you were talking about Ukraine abroad, and which of those questions staying, let's say, an elephant in the room?
Oh, no question at all. Corruption. That's the thing that that's the association that everybody very quickly has. And so I think demonstrating, and I think some efforts have been made on this, some quite impressive efforts that have been made on this, that, you know, there is a very major, also because, you know, people are taxpayers in the West. They know a lot of money is going to Ukraine one way or another. So it's kind of, you know, it gets personal to people who are taxpayers. And the framework in which I would do this, because every second word I heard in Ukraine was Europe. I mean, the passion for coming closer to Europe was just absolutely compelling. I don't hear anything like that in France or Germany, I can tell you, but there's much more passion for Europe in Ukraine. So that I would focus that whole story around the European path and actually the conditions for EU membership. Now, that's a little bit tricky because some of those conditions are being set by someone who himself is a travesty of European values, namely Viktor Orban, right, in Hungary. But nonetheless, I think trying to tell the story about becoming a European liberal democratic law-abiding country is going to be really important. I think that's the negative stereotype that you'd find most often in the West.
Olesya, maybe your perspective.
In my case, it's a little bit different. I mean, I'm pleased to say that a lot of questions that were being asked of me over and over and over again this time last year are not being asked anymore, because I think a lot of people who are asking them, they realize that those were purely planted by Russian propaganda, and sort of, you know, that's how they penetrated our minds and our information space. But one that maybe still remains is the sort of misunderstanding, misconception is misunderstanding of Ukrainian nationalism, or what nationalism means for Ukraine. So often people immediately talk to me about post-Second World War nationalism or Second World War. Before it is Bandera, of course. I feel like people know if there's one Ukrainian people know, it's Bandera, nobody else, and Zelensky now, which is very interesting. And they know nothing else, and they immediately assume that that is what nationalism means for Ukrainians now. And when you begin to explain to them that what we see now, what we saw in 2014 on the Maidan and since is civic nationalism, is political nationalism, is something that is not about division, it's about unity. It's unity around really basic protection of basic rights, about human rights. And it's where Crimean Tatar will stand next to someone who's Ukrainian Jew and Ukrainian Pole or Hungarian or Roma, to protect each other's rights, because once they protect that person's right, their own right will be protected too, to freedom of expression, assembly, and all of those other things that we are fighting for and that Russia is trying to deprive us from. So I think there's still a long way to explain the nature of Ukrainian civic nationalism, that there's a long tradition of it, and that is exactly what's flourishing at the moment, and that we need to keep it going the day after, as you say.
I think that our next question, it just like really capturing it very well, because it's kind of provocative question on Western minds background, that don't you think it's slightly challenging for the former empires to take a perspective of the anti-colonizing processes, especially in terms of language, and how can we help to unpack the context in which Ukraine is defining itself as a political nation? This is really linked with what you said, Olesya, about, you know, the different understanding on a nationalism, right? That of Ukrainians and the others. But we have this conversation just literally a few days ago about how the former empires could stand on the position on the anti-colonizing processes and understand and feel for the country fighting it right now.
But you know, I mean, most Brits would say that losing the empire has been liberating for us. So in a way, countries that have been empires know how liberating it is to lose it. I mean, I think it's true that there are some people in the elite, say the top of the military or the diplomats and so on, policymakers, who kind of like dealing with, a suspicious formulation, important countries, like, you know, big countries, Russia, the United States. There's a little bit of that. But as I said to you, the mood of the times in a country like Britain and elsewhere, France and Germany, is an anti-colonial mood. So you're building on a good foundation there. Could I say just one more thing? Because I guess we're coming to an end, which is, you know, I think what you should want from the world outside Ukraine is for people to go on asking questions. It's a matter of them asking the right questions, because what you don't want is them to stop asking questions at all. And one question which, since Penn is our host, is very close to my heart, is the question of free speech. I mean, you know, I understand why you have a news telethon, a TV news telethon at the beginning of a war, but do you really still need it now? Can you really get back to democracy if there is essentially one monopoly news channel? You know, a lot of people in Ukraine I talk to also have a concern about this, so that I think, you know, that's something where there are good questions to be asked.
And these questions are being asked, which is encouraging for me. And of course, apart from that one channel that you're talking about, we also have fantastic outlets like Kyiv Independent in the English language. I encourage all of our listeners to check it out and to read the news there. I think very brief answer to the question, Olha, that you asked from our listener, the key in that formulation is former empires. It's former, yeah, the key is former, you know. And also, I think it would be great to draw on that knowledge of decolonization and all of those discussions and that have already happened elsewhere, and honestly have been happening in Ukraine in the 90s too. It's just those texts by people like Oksana Zabushko or you know, others have not been necessarily translated. Tamara Hundarova is another one who springs to mind, so have not been necessarily known outside of Ukraine. But you know, we need to continue these discussions, and that's why I congratulate you again for setting up this amazing format, and I hope this continues. You know, conversations, discussions, sharing of knowledge, so we learn from each other's experiences.
Yeah, no, likewise. Great conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. And yeah, we're coming to the end. And as Olesya says at the end of her book, I don't have a big quote to end. Actually, I have a few. I absolutely love the reference to Pericles in your article, Ukraine in Our Future. The secret of happiness is liberty, and the secret of liberty is courage. Vola. We mentioned it a few times today. Vola as a freedom, vola as a will. But if you would ask yourself, what can I do today as an intellectual? My final answer after this year of conversation will be pretty simple. Learn, think, listen, and communicate. Where you have a room for dialogue, you have no place for war. Thank you so much. That was a great talk. And this all would not be possible without the support of our partners, obviously, the US Embassy in Ukraine, Pan America, the Ukrainian Institute, the Ukrainian Institute London, Ukraine World, Local History, Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, the Harman Institute at Columbia University. My deepest respect to Pan Ukraine, which continues to stand on the front lines in the name of freedom and truth. I want to use a chance to thank to all the invisible team of Dialogues, Oksana Mamchenkova, executive producer, Olha Khromeychuk, streams technical support, Miroslava Mochnatska, design, text versions, Irina Rodina, Ukrainian translations, Anna Vovchenko, web page developers, Nadia Barkovska and Alexei Arikov, and the precious supervision and inspiration of our dear Tatiana Teren, executive director of PAN Ukraine. PAN International is always proud to be a platform that supports freedom of expression. Watch our dialogues in archive on our both websites. They're still actual. Also, after each episode, we prepare publications in Ukrainian and English, and the collection of it will be released soon as well. So follow social media, PAN Ukraine, PAN International, all the other partners. We hope our project gave you enough insights and material for deep thinking. Thank you again, our great speakers. Hope to see you soon. That was a great privilege having you here with us. And our dear viewers, for your solidarity. This is what our dialogues are about. Spread the word and stand with Ukraine. This is our shared responsibility today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Olesya. Thank you, Professor.